In earlier episodes, we explored commanders whose brilliance changed the course of World War II. Their leadership, daring tactics, and ability to inspire men under fire made them legends. But history is not written only by winners. Today, we turn to the opposite side of the battlefield, the commanders whose catastrophic decisions led to humiliating defeats. These are the generals whose failures cost tens of thousands of lives and altered the balance of the war. We begin with one of the most infamous examples in British military history. Arthur Percival was placed in charge of British and Imperial forces defending Malaya and the strategically vital fortress of Singapore. At the time, Singapore was considered an impenetrable stronghold, the Gibraltar of the East. It housed massive coastal guns, deep harbors, and one of Britain's most important naval bases. Yet within a matter of weeks, this powerful position collapsed in one of the most shocking defeats the British Empire ever suffered. One of Percival's greatest mistakes was his complete underestimation of the enemy. The Japanese forces advancing through Malaya were fast, aggressive, and highly trained for jungle warfare. They used bicycles to move swiftly through terrain the British believed was impassable. Instead of preparing layered defenses and adapting to jungle combat, Percival clung to outdated assumptions that the terrain itself would slow the enemy. Even more damaging was his refusal to construct strong field fortifications early in the campaign. Percival believed defensive works would hurt troop morale. He thought preparing for retreat would psychologically weaken his soldiers. The opposite occurred. British and Commonwealth troops found themselves poorly protected, widely scattered, and constantly outmaneuvered. Instead of concentrating his forces, Percival spread them thin across northern Malaya. This prevented units from supporting one another during Japanese breakthroughs. As a result, entire sections of the British line collapsed in isolation. In some cases, units lost contact with headquarters for days. Confusion spread and panic followed. Leading the Japanese advance was the brilliant commander,
Tomoyuki Yamashita. With fewer troops and limited supplies, he relied on speed, deception, and relentless pressure. His forces constantly attacked from unexpected directions, creating the illusion of overwhelming numbers. British commanders repeatedly overestimated the size of the enemy force, leading to unnecessary retreats. Within weeks, the British were driven all the way back to Singapore itself. Despite possessing far more men, artillery, and supplies than the attackers, the defenders were already disorganized and demoralized. The Japanese paused briefly, not because they were defeated, but to resupply and evaluate British defenses. Singapore's massive coastal guns, designed to repel a naval invasion, proved nearly useless. The British had assumed the island could never be attacked from the landward side. This fatal assumption now revealed itself in full. There were few prepared defenses facing north, where the Japanese crossed into the city. When the final assault came, the collapse was rapid. Civilian panic erupted, water supplies were threatened, and communications broke down. Percival, convinced that resistance was hopeless, chose to surrender. On February 15, 1942, over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops laid down their arms, the largest surrender in British military history. Winston Churchill later called it the worst disaster and the greatest capitulation in British history. For the men who marched into captivity, it was the beginning of years of brutal imprisonment. Thousands would die in Japanese labor camps. Percival himself spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. Ironically, he would later be present at Japan's formal surrender in 1945, standing alongside Allied commanders. But history never forgot his failure. To many, his defeat symbolized everything that went wrong with outdated imperial thinking, rigid command structures, and an unwillingness to adapt to modern warfare. In 1939, France entered World War II confident in its military leadership. At the top of that leadership stood Maurice Gamelin, a veteran officer shaped entirely by the trench warfare of World War I. He had helped plan the defensive victory at the Battle of the Marne in 1914.
1914 and was widely regarded as one of France's most respected strategic minds. When Germany invaded Poland, Gamelin became commander-in-chief of all French forces. However, the war that was coming would bear little resemblance to the one he had prepared for. Gamelin firmly believed the next conflict would resemble the slow, grinding battles of 1914 to 1918. He relied heavily on static defenses and the Maginot Line, expecting German forces to smash themselves against fortified positions. What he failed to anticipate was the speed and flexibility of modern mechanized warfare. A small group of forward-thinking officers, including Charles de Gaulle, argued that war would be decided by fast-moving armored formations supported by aircraft. Gamelin ignored these warnings. He remained convinced that any German attack through the Ardennes forest was impossible. That belief would prove fatal. Even worse than his strategic blindness was the structure of his command. Gamelin operated his headquarters far behind the front lines. Astonishingly, his command post lacked reliable radio communication. Instead of real-time intelligence, he depended on couriers traveling by motorcycle and car. Orders often arrived hours or even days too late. Some units never received updated commands at all. When the German attack finally came in May 1940, it shattered French expectations. German armored columns smashed through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse River, and raced toward the English Channel. The French army, tied to rigid deployment plans, was quickly outflanked. As the situation spiraled out of control, political leaders panicked. Gamelin was dismissed just days before the collapse of France and replaced by Maxime Weygand. Weygand inherited an already doomed military position, but his early decisions only worsened the disaster. His first major act was to cancel a counterattack that might have slowed the German advance. Instead, Weygand sought a diplomatic solution, believing Germany might accept negotiations similar to those of World War I. While French diplomats debated, German forces reorganized and struck again with devastating effect. Within 6 weeks, France was defeated.
The American units. The U.S. forces, inexperienced and disjointed, were spread too thin and lacked proper defensive positioning. German armor smashed through American lines, inflicting heavy casualties and triggering widespread panic. The defeated Kasserine was a shock to the U.S. Army. Entire formations were thrown into retreat, equipment was abandoned, morale collapsed. While frontline officers and soldiers fought bravely, the lack of leadership cohesion made effective resistance nearly impossible. Fredendall bore much of the responsibility. His refusal to concentrate forces, his decision to remain far from danger, and his failure to establish clear command relationships all contributed to the defeat. In the aftermath, the U.S. Army acted decisively. Fredendall was relieved of command. Though not publicly disgraced, he was quietly transferred back to the United States, where he was given responsibility for training rather than combat leadership. The Kasserine Pass became a painful but necessary lesson for the American military. It exposed weaknesses in doctrine, coordination, and command culture. From that defeat would emerge a stronger, more adaptable U.S. Army, but for Fredendall, it marked the end of his combat career. Mark Clark remains one of the most controversial American commanders of World War II. Brash, ambitious, and intensely image-conscious, he rose rapidly through the ranks and was eventually placed in charge of U.S. forces invading Italy. The Italian campaign, however, would become one of the most grinding and costly operations of the war. The Allied plan to invade Italy in 1943 was heavily championed by Winston Churchill, who believed that striking at what he called the soft underbelly of Europe would lead to a rapid collapse of Axis resistance. Clark was tasked with turning that strategy into victory. Instead, the campaign became a bloody stalemate. Italy's terrain was a defender's dream: steep mountains, narrow valleys, poor roads, and limited mobility. German forces turned these advantages into a chain of deadly defensive lines. Clark's army advanced slowly, often at enormous cost.
One of the key moments of failure came during the amphibious
Disembarking at Anzio, Clark appointed John P. Lucas to command the operation. Instead of pushing inland aggressively, the Allied force hesitated. German reinforcements poured in. The beachhead turned into a deadly trap, costing thousands of casualties and months of brutal fighting. Another symbol of the Italian campaign's disaster was the Battle for Monte Cassino. This ancient monastery sat atop a key defensive position blocking the road to Rome. Allied forces launched repeated frontal assaults against heavily entrenched German troops. The monastery itself was eventually bombed to rubble, yet the destruction only created even better defensive cover for the Germans. Clark also missed a crucial opportunity during the breakthrough at Anzio and later during the advance at Salerno. Instead of trapping retreating German armies, Clark redirected his forces toward capturing Rome first. While the liberation of Rome made headlines, the German army escaped intact and continued fighting in northern Italy for nearly another year. Clark's leadership style further damaged his reputation. Many officers described him as excessively concerned with personal glory. He often shifted blame for failures onto subordinates, while taking credit for successes. Strategically, he preferred caution over bold risk, even when conditions favored aggressive action. In fairness, Clark never suffered a catastrophic battlefield defeat like some other commanders. But he also never achieved the decisive breakthrough that might have shortened the Italian campaign. Instead, victory came slowly, paid for with tens of thousands of Allied lives. By the end of the war, Italy remained one of the most costly and frustrating theaters for the Western Allies. Clark finished the war as a celebrated general, but historians continue to debate whether his caution, ego, and misjudgments unnecessarily prolonged the fighting.